You're in the middle of a conversation. Someone says something that cuts deeper than it should. Maybe it's a careless comment, a joke that wasn't really a joke, or a moment when someone dismisses how you feel. The room keeps moving, people keep talking. But something inside you goes completely still. I've felt that moment before. Words rise in your mind and then disappear. You don't argue, you don't explain, you just go quiet. From the outside, that silence can look strange. Some people think it means you don't care enough to react. Others assume you're being distant or cold. But inside, it's rarely empty. Inside, it's crowded with thoughts, questions, and emotions that suddenly feel too heavy to release. Psychologist Carl Rogers once wrote, "What is most personal is most universal in On Becoming a Person." The feelings we hide the most often turn out to be the ones many others carry too. So what really happens in the minds of people who go quiet when they're hurt? Is silence avoidance? Or is it something deeper, a form of emotional protection the mind uses when words no longer feel safe? In that quiet moment after being hurt, something subtle but powerful happens inside the mind. It's almost like an invisible switch flips. The conversation continues around you, but your brain begins to slow everything down. Psychologists sometimes describe this as part of the nervous system's protective response. When emotional pain appears suddenly, the brain doesn't always choose to fight or argue. Sometimes it chooses stillness. Words feel heavy, thoughts scatter, you pause. You might notice it in everyday situations. A friend makes a comment that feels dismissive. A partner brushes off something important to you. At work, someone criticizes you publicly in a meeting. In those moments, many people expect an immediate response, a defense, an explanation, maybe even an argument, but instead you go quiet. It isn't because nothing is happening inside. Quite the opposite. Inside, the mind is trying to make sense of the emotional shock. Did that really just happen? Did they mean it that way? Why did that hurt so much? Psychiatrist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk wrote in The Body Keeps the Score, "Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. When that sense of safety is suddenly shaken, even in a small moment, the mind instinctively pauses to protect itself. Silence, in this sense, is not emptiness. It is the mind buying time. Time to process, time to stabilize, time to understand what just changed in a relationship that once felt safe. And once the initial shock settles, a second layer begins to emerge. The quiet decision not to react too quickly. After the first emotional pause, something more intentional often follows. The quiet becomes a form of protection. Many people who withdraw when they're hurt are not trying to avoid the situation. They're trying to prevent the situation from getting worse. Because they know something important about emotions. Pain can easily turn into words we later regret. Think about how arguments often unfold. Someone feels hurt, reacts immediately, raises their voice, says something sharp, and suddenly the original issue is buried under layers of anger and defensiveness. People who go quiet have often learned this the hard way. Instead of reacting in the heat of the moment, they step back. They allow the emotional storm to pass before saying something they might not truly mean. What looks like distance is often restraint. Psychologist Daniel Goleman, known for his work on emotional intelligence, wrote in his book Emotional Intelligence, "If your emotional abilities aren't in hand, if you are not able to manage your distressing emotions, then no matter how smart you are not going to get very far." Silence can be one way people manage those distressing emotions. It creates a small psychological space between feeling hurt and responding to it. You might see this when someone simply nods instead of arguing, or changes the subject, or becomes unusually quiet during a tense conversation. They are not ignoring the pain. They are holding it carefully. But this quiet protection often hides another deeper fear beneath it. The worry that even if they do explain their feelings, they might still not be understood. That deeper hesitation often comes from experience. Many people who grow quiet when they're hurt have learned, sometimes slowly and painfully, that explaining their feelings does not always bring understanding. Sometimes it brings defensiveness. Sometimes it brings dismissal. And sometimes it brings the subtle feeling that their emotions are being judged instead of heard. Think about a small everyday moment. You tell someone that their comment bothered you, expecting a calm conversation. Instead, they laugh it off. You're too sensitive, or they immediately defend themselves. That's not what I meant. Suddenly the conversation shifts away from your pain and toward proving that your reaction is unreasonable. After a few experiences like that, the mind begins to adapt. Instead of repeating the same vulnerable explanation again and again, many people instinctively step back. Silence becomes a safer option than risking another misunderstanding. It is not punishment or manipulation, it is caution. Psychologist Marshall Rosenberg, the creator of nonviolent communication, wrote in Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, "When we hear the other person's feelings and needs, we recognize our common humanity. But when that recognition doesn't happen, when feelings are dismissed instead of received, people naturally start protecting themselves. So the quiet person begins to observe more than they speak. They watch reactions carefully. They measure whether a relationship is emotionally safe enough to hold honest conversation. And during that quiet observation, another realization slowly emerges. The pain they feel might be connected not just to the moment itself, but to something deeper within them. People who withdraw into silence after being hurt are often emotionally perceptive individuals. They notice things that others overlook. A slight change in tone, a pause that feels different. The absence of warmth in a familiar interaction. Their minds are constantly reading emotional signals, often without consciously trying to. This ability can be a gift. It allows them to understand others deeply, to empathize quickly, and to build meaningful connections. But it also means that when disappointment appears, it lands with greater weight. A careless comment that someone else might brush off can linger in their thoughts for hours, not because they want to dwell on it, but because their mind is trying to understand what it means about the relationship. Psychologist Elaine Aron, who researched highly sensitive individuals, explains in her book The Highly Sensitive Person. Highly sensitive individuals process information more deeply. This deeper processing means emotional experiences, both positive and negative, are often felt more intensely. So when trust feels shaken, silence becomes a space for that deeper processing. The quiet person is not just reacting to the words that were spoken. They are examining the emotional meaning behind them. They are asking themselves questions that others might not even consider. Did this reveal something about how they see me? Was this moment accidental, or does it show a deeper pattern? And as these questions begin to unfold internally, the silence gradually transforms into something more reflective, a quiet search for understanding. Once the first waves of emotion settle, the silence often turns inward. The mind begins to reflect. Instead of immediately confronting the other person, many quiet individuals start examining the situation from multiple angles. They replay the moment in their thoughts, not to torture themselves, but to understand it. Maybe you've experienced this late at night. The conversation is over. The house is quiet, but your mind returns to that one sentence someone said earlier in the day. You hear the tone again. You notice details you missed before. Was it intentional? Was it careless? Or was it something else entirely? This kind of reflection is closely tied to self-awareness. Rather than assuming they are completely right or the other person is completely wrong, quiet people often explore their own reactions too. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman describes this reflective process in Thinking Fast and Slow. He explains that humans have two modes of thinking: fast, automatic reactions, and slower, more deliberate reflection. He writes, "The essence of intuitive heuristics is that when faced with a difficult question, we often answer an easier one instead. But people who withdraw into silence often resist that quick shortcut. Instead of jumping to conclusions, they stay with the harder questions. Why did this hurt me so much? What expectation of mine was broken? What does this situation reveal about the relationship?" This quiet internal dialogue is not weakness. It is the mind slowly translating emotional pain into understanding. But there is a delicate balance here. Because when reflection continues for too long without resolution, silence can begin to change shape, and what began as thoughtful reflection can gradually turn into something heavier. The same silence that protects the mind can also become a place where loneliness grows. When hurt feelings remain unspoken for too long, the quiet person begins carrying the emotional weight alone. The other person may not even realize something important happened. From their perspective, the moment has already passed. But inside the quiet mind, the story is still unfolding. You might see this in everyday relationships. Someone withdraws after a difficult interaction. They become polite, calm, even friendly on the surface, yet something subtle has changed. Conversations become shorter. Eye contact fades more quickly. The emotional closeness slowly weakens. Not because they stopped caring, but because the pain was never shared. Psychologist Susan David, known for her work on emotional agility, writes in Emotional Agility, "Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. Avoiding emotional discomfort completely can quietly limit our connections with others." When silence replaces communication entirely, misunderstandings remain unresolved. The mind keeps replaying possibilities instead of hearing real answers. And over time, this internal rumination can create a feeling of emotional distance, even in relationships that once felt close. The quiet person may begin to wonder whether their feelings matter at all. Yet within that same silence, something else can begin to grow, a deeper awareness that eventually changes how they choose to respond. Something interesting often happens after enough moments like this. The silence begins to change. At first it was shock, then protection, then reflection. But over time, people who repeatedly go quiet when they are hurt start learning something important about themselves. They begin to recognize their emotions more clearly. Instead of reacting immediately, they notice the feeling first. The tightening in the chest, the quiet disappointment, the small voice inside asking, "Why did that affect me so much?" This awareness creates a new kind of power, not the power to control others, but the power to understand one's own emotional landscape. Psychologist Viktor Frankl once wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." Silence often becomes that space. It gives the mind time to step back from raw emotion and look at the situation with clarity. The quiet person begins to ask better questions. Not only about the other person, but about their own needs, boundaries, and expectations. Sometimes that reflection leads to a calm conversation later. Sometimes it leads to adjusting expectations. And sometimes it leads to recognizing that certain relationships are not as emotionally safe as they once seemed. What started as silence born from hurt slowly transforms into silence guided by awareness. And from that awareness, a deeper understanding of communication and of oneself begins to emerge. When someone becomes quiet after being hurt, it is easy to misunderstand what that silence means. From the outside, it may look like distance, pride, or emotional coldness. But inside, something much more complex is often unfolding. The mind is pausing, protecting, reflecting, trying to understand a moment that suddenly felt emotionally unsafe. Psychologist Carl Jung once wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Silence often becomes that inward look. It is the mind turning inward to process feelings that words cannot yet carry. For some people, this silence is temporary, a pause before they speak with clarity. For others, it becomes a quiet signal that something important in the relationship has changed. But the deeper truth is this: silence is rarely empty. Sometimes it holds questions that have not been asked yet. Sometimes it holds emotions that are still searching for the right words. And sometimes it holds the quiet moment when a person begins to understand their own heart a little more clearly.